The story opens, and this is something that's often lost, certainly is not represented in most common cultural versions. The story opens with God instructing the Israelites who are on their way out of town to turn around and plop themselves in a terrible position, right? Essentially tells them to trap themselves in front of a body of water. And God says, when Pharaoh hears about this, Pharaoh is going to assume that Israel is lost in the desert and will probably die, right? They're wandering aimlessly. The wilderness has closed in on them, is what Pharaoh is going to think. But God will harden Pharaoh's heart. That is, force Pharaoh to pursue them. Why? In order for God to continue demonstrating God's power. Now, if we've been following our plagues story, we should recognize this all as P. This is the exact same situation. Pharaoh is perfectly happy to let the Israelites die, but God is going to make him do something against his will for the purpose of showing off. But just as quickly as we've gotten our bearings here, something weird happens. Pharaoh has his own change of heart and regrets letting Israel go. And this, of course, is precisely what the Israelites feared in J when they ran away in the middle of the night. The narrative trouble gets worse when in verse 8, God actually does the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Now, that's problematic because according to verse 4, this was supposed to trigger Pharaoh's pursuit of Israel. I'll harden his heart and then he'll pursue. But we're in verse 8 here with the hardening of the heart, and Pharaoh back in verse 6 has already had a change of heart and begun pursuing Israel, like before his heart was hardened. So that's confusing and troubling. A little further on in the text, the Israelites see the Egyptians approaching and are justifiably terrified. And they complain to Moses, who tells them, just sit back and be quiet, and you'll see how God is going to fight for you. You guys have to do absolutely nothing, right? Be quiet, keep still, sit tight. God's going to fight for you. And as soon as God has told them that, as soon as Moses has told them that, God gives Moses totally contradictory instructions. Don't just sit there. Go forward into the water. And again, what's God going to do? God's going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will follow the Israelites into the water. Now, you can imagine the Egyptians might not have been so keen to rush headlong into a miraculously split body of water, but God is going to make them. Right? So again, contradictory instructions. Moses says, stay still. God says, go. Okay, fine. So the Egyptians are going to pursue the Israelites into the water. But if that's the point, then why does God then prevent the Egyptians from approaching the Israelites with this pillar of cloud? And what's he doing all night long if the point is for them to just rush into the water after them? Next problem is Moses is supposed to lift his arm over the sea to split it, right? In the famous gesture from the movie. But then when he does, God pushes the water back with a wind. Now, I'm not a meteorologist, but I've felt wind before, and I don't think wind, like an eastern wind, can split a body of water in half. Maybe in some circumstances, but I don't think it's normal. Now, when Moses then holds his arm out again to bring the waters back, the Egyptians flee from the water. Flee where, right? You can't run away from water that's closing in on both sides on you. And why does God have to throw the Egyptians back into the water, right? Throw them from where, right? If they're being drowned like in the movies. Okay, that's some of the major problems. There's other smaller ones that I didn't get into, but now having shown you the problems, here's the solution, which you may have already anticipated. Here's the P story, built very tightly around 3 divine instructions and their fulfillment. The first one is God says to Moses, put yourselves in this intentionally difficult position, and Pharaoh will pursue you when I harden Pharaoh's heart. And that's exactly what happens. That's speech 1 and fulfillment 1. Then Yahweh says to Moses, okay, now I want you to split the water, and you go through, and then we're going to make the Egyptians pursue into the water also. And that's precisely what happens. And then the third speech is, okay, bring the waters back, stretch out your hand again, return the water, and the Egyptians all die. As with the plagues story in P, there is no tension here. Right? The whole thing is planned from the get-go. God knows at every stage exactly what's going to happen, and it happens exactly as God wants. God is, again, just toying with the Egyptians, just demonstrating power. This story is, in its action sequence, pretty close to the traditional reading and to the movies. Right? You can picture it. The thing that's different is in fact this lack of narrative tension, right? Which is to say, the very purpose of the event is not what we have come to expect from the traditional readings. So that's P. Here's the J story, which is all tension. So it begins with Pharaoh regretting having let Israel go and deciding to pursue them, right? So again, this is, remember I said that the 3-day journey into the wilderness to worship and then we'll come right back was totally made up and a lie. And you can see here, Pharaoh suddenly realizing, my God, they weren't going to worship. They've just gone, right? Pharaoh realizes that the people have fled, right? And that's the moment where he says, we're going to go get those guys. And the Israelites, as Pharaoh approaches, are afraid, naturally enough. But Moses says to them, you just sit tight and watch. God is going to do the fighting for you. And as the Egyptians approach, God prevents them from getting too close to the Israelites, obscures their vision, right? Blocks them from seeing what's going on. And you might notice that just as in Jay's plagues, so too here, there's an element of time, right? This takes place overnight. Whereas in the P story, they just walk right in and walk right out. But here there's a passage of time, and it's actually crucial to the plot, because what happens during this night? God drives back the sea with an east wind. Now, in order to understand this, we have to get ourselves out of the mindset of the P story, or our traditional readings of it. There is no crossing the middle of a body of water here. Right? There's no part in the J story where Israel has positioned itself, in this tricky spot in front of some body of water in the middle of the wilderness. So where is any of this taking place then? Well, if you were going to go from Egypt to Canaan, what's the quickest route? The quickest route is up the coast. That's how you go. Right? Clearly the fastest way to get there. I should say, if you needed me to, obviously this map is not a biblical one. The West Bank not quite being part of the biblical story, at least not in that name. Okay, so here we are going up the coast, presumably, since we haven't been told anything else. So when God pushes back the waters with an east wind, what does that mean? I apologize for my inability to draw a straight line. But in any case, the east wind is going to shift the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. What was water is now dry ground. Now, when the Egyptians start their pursuit again in the morning, right, their vision having been obscured so that they couldn't see this manipulation of the coastline, they're going to continue traveling the way that they were before to follow the Israelites, which is to say, along the coast. Right? But God, as they start to go that way, right, begins to fight. Right? He locks their wheels so that they can't move very quickly. Right? They're getting bogged down in the mud. And they recognize what Moses already told the Israelites. God is fighting for Israel. We're kind of in trouble here. And when the day breaks, the sea returns to its normal state. And where is Egypt? Following the coastline as they were before, but the coastline isn't the coastline. It's actually the middle of the sea. And the waters returning isn't two sides closing in as in P. It's a tidal wave. It's the return of the Mediterranean to its natural coastline. Now in the story, when the Egyptians are fleeing from the water, now that makes sense, right? They're running toward the natural coastline, but God throws them back into the water. And the conclusion of the J story, given everything we've seen, is perfect. God has actually saved Israel. Unlike in P, where there's nothing to be saved from because there was never any real danger. And Israel, which was so fearful upon seeing the Egyptians approaching, now learns the lesson to fear Yahweh, as is proper. The lesson of the experience at the sea is for Israel to recognize God's power. Whereas in P, the lesson was for Egypt. Now, this J story, in terms of its plot, is nothing at all like what we know, except for the narrative tension and the purpose of the event, right? The actual saving of Israel from danger. In other words, our traditional understanding of this story is a combination of P's plot and J's message. And we wouldn't have our story without both of the stories underlying it.